Starting the conversation now, letting everybody in. Hi, everybody. Just give us a moment while we see if any latecomers are still waiting to arrive. But I think we can more or less start now. All right. Yeah, well, welcome everybody to this webinar that we're hosting this evening with Simon Norfolk. I'd like to just start by introducing myself. I'm Claire. I'm the head of travel for ISHKAR. And just to give you a little bit of context about ISHKAR and what we're all about, ISHKAR was born out of a desire to break down barriers, both real and perceived, by regions of the world impacted by conflict. And we aim to do this by assisting the trade of objects created by artisans in countries impacted by embargoes and logistical challenges as a result of warfare, but as well as breaking down barriers to understanding through travel, barriers caused by misconceptions of regions that are all too often demonized and stereotyped as a result of their political backgrounds. And we try to do that by showing people countries in person in partnership with people who have interesting perspectives on those regions and can show people a different side to those regions to maybe what they would get through the media and through typical news reports and those sorts of things. So with all that in mind, I would like to introduce Simon. And our partnership with Simon Norfolk came about through efforts to show people a different side of Yemen to maybe what they've become exposed to in the media, as Simon himself has traveled to Socotra Island in Yemen a number of times over the years. And it's through Simon's talents as a photographer that he's produced some really beautiful and awe-inspiring images of a region that is usually presented in a different way. So amongst his many accolades, Simon has won 2 World Press Photo Awards, 3 Sony World Photography Awards, amongst others, and was also the first British photographer to have a solo show at the Tate Modern. Though over the course of his career, he's shot 10 years worth of assignments for the New York Times. He's also a Nat Geo photographer, and he's also flown a helicopter into a volcano looking for bears. He's slept in a shipping container on an archaeological site in Afghanistan, and spent an evening drinking plum brandy with a war criminal, among many other talents. He's also as British as Austin Powers, you could say, because he's shot 2 seconds of the movie Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me, if you believe. We're also joined by Tarim Contin-Kennedy, who we work with as one of our partners for travel to Socotra. And although Tarim has Italian and American heritage through his parents, he grew up in Sana'a and learned to speak the local dialect of Arabic near perfectly during his time working in the Sana'a Zoo. So Tarim from an early age began visiting Socotra routinely and has had a lifelong passion for zoology and wildlife conservation. So he joins us this evening to give a little bit more extra context to Socotra Island as a unique part of the world. And during his time in Yemen, Tarim has also contributed to renowned international publications such as Al Jazeera, the Guardian and Esquire on the topic of wildlife conservation in the Arabian Peninsula. So Tarim will feed in at the end of our chat to discuss together with Simon a little bit about the biological diversity of Socotra. Though for now, I will hand over to Simon to tell us a little bit about his career and how he went from documenting human battlefields to environmental ones. So Simon, if I can ask you to pick up from here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Claire. Great. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm just going to do a little kind of background on who I am, where I've kind of come from. My beginnings really are in Afghanistan. And then nowadays, I'm doing much more work in to do with climate change. And I'll show you one of the projects in a little bit of depth, really, about kind of how I think about a project, how I create techniques for lighting things, and kind of how I go about making a piece of work rather than just showing you some lovely pictures and not really explaining where it comes from. I think the explanations about how somebody makes a piece of work are probably more interesting than just reeling off carousels of pictures from here, there and everywhere. And then finally, I'll concentrate more on the pictures that I've made in Socotra over 3 trips that I've been there now. And I think even now, there's some pictures that the actual students, the travelers that were on last year's trip, they very kindly allowed me to include some pictures of their own in the slideshow. I'll show you at the end. So my kind of beginnings as a photographer really as a proper photographer was in Afghanistan in 2001. I went during the invasion. I went with this huge wooden view camera that required a blanket over your head and a magnifying glass. It looked like a it looked like a liability. It looked like a target. It looked like an idiot. But I think that was kind of part of its kind of defensibility. Was it looked so ridiculous, it really wasn't worth wasting bullets on. And I think that's kind of how I got away with it in Afghanistan, really. It really wasn't worth shooting at that maniac. And I made this lovely set of work, which kind of really completely altered my career. This picture became sort of like, a kind of key picture for me, but it was suddenly when I came back, I was published by the New York Times Magazine. I became a la-di-da artist. I was selling prints through galleries. I had a gallery in New York. I still have a gallery in New York, Los Angeles, and London. People were giving me prizes and being nice to me. Same people who 6 months before wouldn't answer the phone to me were being nice to me after Afghanistan. But I also felt that I owed a great deal to the place because emotionally, it was kind of a really huge kind of step change for me, a change in my career, change in the way that I photograph the landscape, but also looking at battlefields in particular as this place that is for me, I'm more of an archaeologist than a photographer. My job is to kind of scrape through the landscape, find stuff, pull it out of the land and go, look what I found. Look at this. Look, I found this. Look, what does it mean? What does it mean? Right? Which is exactly what archaeologists do. And for me, that's the most exciting thing about photography. And sometimes the pictures will look like something else entirely. And all of the work that I do is kind of soaked in a kind of English romanticism. It comes out of staring at the paintings in the National Gallery in London, the paintings that I used to see on the walls of stately homes that I used to visit, English country house gardens, all of those English values about romanticism. In many ways, the pictures are an attempt to copy the kind of paintings that I was looking at. Paintings by Caspar David Friedrich, paintings by Claude Lorraine, Nicolas Poussin. I mean, for me, this looks like a Claude Lorraine to me. These ruins are exactly what you see in the kind of Claude Lorraine paintings in the National Gallery. But in his pictures, they're ruins of ancient Rome, and in my pictures, they're ruins of what the Mujahideen did to the western side of Kabul. It's a good example. This building, I didn't know what it was. It was just a shell when I photographed it. No one could explain to me. Years later, like a decade later, I found out it was the Institute of Archaeology, which for me was just brilliant because that's kind of exactly what it's meant to be. The fact that it was the Archaeology Museum kind of made it for me. I'm going through these quite quickly. Again, a picture that was meant to look like a kind of Claude Lorraine painting, a shepherd boy gazing upon a distant vista of ruins and a landscape, golden light crashing across it. This is actually in Buddha. You can see in the center of the picture is the niche where the Buddha was in Bamiyan before the Taliban blew up there's two Buddhas. This is actually the entrance into a local commander's headquarters with a kind of victory arch, a kind of pathetic, shadow of a victory arch, as it were. So I shot these pictures, entirely self-funded and entirely my own volition in Afghanistan, but it kind of completely changed my career when I came back. New York Times got hold of the pictures. I always think this picture has got something, for me, it's always a reference to the Twin Towers, this kind of picture, which the New York Times clearly would find important. But it's actually the controlled explosion of some cluster bombs that the Americans had dropped all the way through these orchards and gardens on the Shomali Plain, just north of Kabul. This is another one of these ones that looks like an archaeological object. It looks like the spine of some monster has eroded out of the rock. It could be a dinosaur or something. It could be something 100 million years old, or it could be. It's actually the track of a Taliban tank. So when the pictures look most like archaeology, for me, that's the most interesting thing. And it was a kind of natural kind of progress from there was that I spent the next 10 years really photographing archaeology sites, particularly in Afghanistan, particularly with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, who restore archaeological and cultural heritage sites in Afghanistan. I'd been looking at a great deal of Victorian photography of the British Empire, and so this is a kind of my pastiche of those kind of Victorian photographers from the 1850s. But I spent years working for the AKTC and on their wonderful projects restoring Afghanistan's cultural heritage. And I think together it's a kind of body of work of an Afghanistan that really nobody outside of Afghanistan expects to see. You don't expect to see gardens, fortresses, palaces, beautiful blue tiled mosques like you get in Central Asia. This is the fantastic Bhagavapur Gardens. It's a very old picture of the Bhagavapur Gardens, which is a Mughal era garden. So, if you've been to Bukhara in Central Asia, you might recognize this kind of architecture. And if you've been to the Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir, you might see these kind of gardens. Afghanistan is in the center of all of those kind of networks of culture and an empire, really. It's a traditional Mughal garden with water down the center of it and a wall all the way around it, just like you see in Kashmir. And all of these have been restored by the AKTC. And I was there last June photographing how the gardens have developed and how people are using the gardens. And I was there in June. I never had a series of pictures go from kind of current affairs to ancient archive faster in my entire life, because I'm certain that women are not living like this and spending their Fridays like this in the garden anymore since the Taliban came back to power. So these pictures, when I shot them, were current affairs. 6 weeks after I came home, they were a previous regime, ancient history archive. But I love photographing the AKTC's projects. I love going around looking at Afghanistan. I feel it's part of the debt that I owe to the place, my kind of moral responsibility to it a little bit, paying back my dues because of what it did for me, but also just the joy of seeing these objects being kind of brought back to life. Afghanistan has an amazing series of Buddhist, Hindu, an incredible mix. Even the British Empire, of course, was there. And all of those empires have left behind a kind of detritus of their imperial expansion, usually because Afghanistan was the sort of the immovable mountain that they came across, and they never got any further. And so each of them has left behind their kind of imperial rubbish in the landscape. And my job is to kind of photograph these things. This is the Ikhtiyar-ud-Din fortress in Herat, some Mongol era, so it's kind of 12th century, 13th century, but it's the most extraordinary structure. It looks like something out of Star Wars. It looks like something from the Casbah or Morocco, but it's actually something on the borders of Persia from the 12th, 13th century. And I don't think anyone thinks that buildings like this exist in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is just a series of cliches, mostly shot out the back of a helicopter as it's kind of swoops across the landscape, or shot from inside a tank looking out through that slit. So it's a kind of joy to photograph the restoration, wonderful restoration work the AKTC did on buildings like this. This is a kind of guest house and palace of the foreign ministry in the center of Kabul. And that kind of aesthetic I took into whole projects that I did in Afghanistan. This was following in the footsteps of John Burke, who was the first ever photographer to enter Afghanistan in 1878. He was an Irishman, but he traveled with the English invading Afghanistan in 1878 and created this beautiful record, an unbelievably rich record of this kind of first imperial colonial contact between these two cultures that had been completely unknown to each other pretty much before this, more or less, and certainly the first ever photographs that were made in Afghanistan. And yet he portrays them with a real richness and confidence and almost a kind of touch of swagger, which is the last thing you would expect from an English photographer photographing non-English people in the British Empire. And this was something that I kind of duplicated when I went back to Afghanistan in 2010, following in Burke's kind of footsteps, photographing the same things, copying, pastiching almost his kind of ideas of this carpet that the photographs take place upon, which is like a theater for photography. And also this thing that he does with the viewpoints, where people are looking this way and this way and this way and that way and this way, and that brings a group portrait alive. It gives it this kind of ping, 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 which makes them so exciting. Otherwise, they could just be like a portrait of a soccer team. And this is the work that I won a Sony Press Award for, and a World Press Photo as well, I think. And it was exhibited at Tate Modern. It was a big book-length project that I've done. If you want to see any more of it, I'm afraid you have to look on my website because I'm in too much of a hurry. So the work that I did in Afghanistan led on to several years of photographing in kind of combat zones, really. Not photographing those traditional pictures of soldiers running around and shooting at things and hiding and dashing about and getting wounded and flying about in helicopters, but rather this kind of stillness, this aftermath, definitely trying to make them look like an 18th century landscape painting from Italy. Definitely trying to make them look like that. That's where all of my cultural compost lies. That's where I grow all my stuff, in that kind of cultural compost. Those great romantic painters and poets that traveled through and created so many of our ideas that we still use as artists. Ideas about the sublime and beauty and golden light and ruins, the meaning of ruins, the philosophical meaning of ruins. And I spent years on this, really, photographing either in Baghdad. That previous picture was during the American invasion of Baghdad, or even 10 years after the genocide in Bosnia. Photographing grave sites and mass grave sites from the genocide after the fall of Srebrenica, which is another book that I did in 2005. And this was during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. They'd bombed an oil refinery. So I guess it was a kind of natural sort of sideways slide to go from photographing archaeological sites and ruins, really, bombed ruins, as most of them were, but ruins to photographing actual archaeological sites. And one of the first assignments that I was ever given, the phone rang one day, "Hello, we're National Geographic. Would you like to come and photograph some ruins for us? We'd like to send you to photograph Mayan temples in Mexico and Guatemala." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? I think it's a lie." And I put the phone down, I rang them back, and they were like, "No, it really is us. We really do want you to photograph this." I was like, wow, great. And never would have occurred to me to ask them to work for them, but such a privilege. And amazing to be allowed to kind of access to these sites. I lit them all at night with huge production numbers. So much money got spent. Not on me, unfortunately. Most of it got spent on lighting and generators and cables and crew and the rest of it. But we were allowed into the sites at night, and I lit them with like a kind of movie sets, a small movie sets worth of lighting and generators, Honda generators and cables all over the place, and made some lovely pictures. And it was such a kind of privilege to be given kind of private access to these places. You know, we would go in as the tourists were being shooed out the door, we would go in and start laying out the generators and the lights to do these wonderful, like a playground, really, like a playground of light and objects for me. And just to sort of bring out the sort of glory and the sort of majesty of these places. I don't know if any of you have ever been to any of these sites like Chichen Itza or the places in central Mexico, but they don't come alive. They're very grey. They're very blocky. There's no surface painting. There's not much surface sculpture. They're big and they're impressive. They're overpowering, but they don't really. They're very grey and blocky, and it was very difficult to light them so that they really had a sense of kind of sparkle about them and majesty. And that was something that I also took onto the next assignment in Geographic when I went to Persepolis in Iran, and again was given a month of private nighttime access to photograph the amazing archaeological site of Persepolis, built by Darius the Great and destroyed in a drunken party by Alexander the Great and his lads in 386 BC, I think it was destroyed. And it's sat there for 2,000 years. Such an amazing site and such a joy to photograph and to be allowed to kind of play with, really. When you have lights like this, you move them around and you're just toying with the objects. You just toy with them with light. It's just a gorgeous process. You need spend a lot of money though to get all the gear. This is the place called Nakhsh Rustam, which is just a few miles from Persepolis, and these are the great graves of the great Persian emperors. I think this is Darius II, that's Xerxes II, Artaxerxes, and this square object in the foreground is possibly some kind of library, possibly some kind of Zoroastrian fire temple. People are not really sure. Amazing sites though. So I wanted to talk to you just a little bit more in depth about one project, something more recent perhaps, just to show you the kind of the way that I go about conceptualizing a problem. And you know, for me, a photograph is a problem to be solved, conceptualizing it, and then coming up with an aesthetic approach that will have some kind of emotional impact and power. For me, that's when photography gets really interesting. So I'm a big cycling nut, and I was on a cycling holiday in Switzerland, and I came across the Rhône Glacier. It's the source of the river Rhône, you know, one of the biggest rivers in France, the one that goes through Geneva, and it goes through Arles, and it goes to the sea at the Bouches du Rhône. And it's one of the biggest rivers in Europe. It comes straight out of the glacier. There's a glacier and there's a river straight out the bottom of it. It's an amazing sight, and it's very easy to come across the Rhône Glacier because it's right by the road. It's the one that everyone can get to. You don't have to put on crampons and go across the mountain and go high. In actual fact, it's right by one of the main roads that joins two halves of Switzerland together. It goes over a pass called the Furka Pass, and the glacier is right there. So it's the kind of famous one. It's the one that everyone's seen. It's the one that all the tourists go to because you virtually barely need to get out of the car to see it. In the past, you could see it from the road. So it's been very famous for a long time. It's been much photographed. It even appears in a James Bond movie, Dr. No. James Bond drives the car. No, it's Goldfinger. Goldfinger. It's the film Goldfinger. And Goldfinger and James Bond chase each other up the pass. And you can see that in the pass there was a hotel that was built there for the tourists, and the glacier was right by the hotel, really visible. And a local shopkeeper took advantage of this, and he opened a little called the Zeiler family. They still own the shop, and they opened a little shop. And they decided to make money out of the tourists by digging a grotto into the ice every year. The ice slips down the mountain. Every year you have to, it melts away and you have to dig it again. But they would charge tourists a few Swiss francs to go inside, and you would see underneath the ice the beautiful, beautiful blue light coming through the 20 feet of ice, and the chill of it. And they would build a little kind of walkway through and charge a few Swiss francs to the tourists. And it was a little business for them, and it lasted for years, still going. But the problem now is climate change has meant that the glacier has disappeared so rapidly. It's now come up the mountain and gone up and round the corner, and you can't even see it. You can't see it from the road. You can't even see it from the gift shop. And it's really damaged their business. And so in an attempt, a rather bonkers attempt to kind of keep their business going, this is the grotto. This is what it looked like in the 1870s, 1860s, when it rolled all the way down the hill. And nowadays you can't even see it from the gift shop. And so in an attempt to keep the business alive, and only to keep the business alive, they cover the glacier with a duvet, with a thermal blanket. It cost the earth. They were doing it. I mean, you need a helicopter to get the stuff up onto the glacier, and they do it this thing called geotextiles, which are these fabrics which they put down under refuse dumps and municipal waste ponds and under airstrips and children's playgrounds and things. It's a big thing in geoengineering now, and they put this on top of it. They can't. That's the entire glacier. You can't cover the whole glacier. They don't need to. They just need to cover enough of the ice to keep them in business. So they put it down. The old cloth just gets completely bashed by the weather. It just pours off the bottom as the glacier slides down and is renewed every year. And every year they have to dig a new blanket. They have to dig a new grotto and put new blanket on top to try and stop it disappearing under them. And it's kind of ridiculous. It just tells us something about, if they're spending 90,000 Swiss francs a year just to keep their stupid business in, imagine what it will cost us to cover the Greenland ice cap. You cannot cover Antarctica with a duvet in an attempt to ward off climate change. We have got to start taking the problems of climate change seriously. They're going to be expensive to fix now. They are going to be multiples of expensive to fix if we don't do it in the future. It is financially in our interest to fix these things now, even though the expense is colossal, because if we leave it, the expense will be even worse. So it's this kind of mad idea that you can somehow cover this thing, even just for this little business. It costs them a fortune to keep in business. I guess one of the things that really interests me, and anybody that knows me will know that Ice Age art is my thing. It's the thing that I spend all my time reading about. It's my obsession, is the Paleolithic and the art that came out of the Paleolithic. In fact, this little beautiful man here, who is 40,000 years old, the Stadel Cave Lion woman, carved in ivory, came out of a cave in Germany, and it's a figure of a human being, maybe a man, maybe a woman, with the head of a lion. And it's 40,000 years old. It's completely mind-boggling how old this object is, and who made this thing, and why did they make it. But kind of for our purposes, what interests me here is, this is for tens of thousands of years, this is the way the human form was portrayed. It doesn't matter whether you go to Syria, whether you go to China, whether you go to Europe, always the human form is portrayed like this: utterly rigid, upright, stiff, hard as stone, completely unrelenting. And it was meant to be that way, because these gods were not gods that you could negotiate with. They're not the God of the New Testament. These are the gods of the Old Testament. I'm telling you what to do. Thus spake the Lord. Do as I say, or I shall smite you down. I'm not interested in negotiating with you. Do as you're damn told, right? They were either gods or they were pharaohs and kings, but the sculpture is meant to express their unnegotiable power, and that's why they're so rigid, completely stiff and upright. And you see it again and again. Except somehow, we don't really know how. To be honest, we don't even know the names of the people that did it. But about 300 BC, somewhere in the Aegean, somebody started sculpting like this. For tens of thousands of years, all sculpture of human form had been like this. Look at everything you see coming out of Old Kingdom Egypt, for example, or coming out of China from this time, or coming out of India from this time. And then suddenly, about 300 BC, somebody starts doing this in stone. In fact, in the hardest stone in the world, Carrara marble. It's just about one of the hardest, it's one of the most expensive stones to work. And suddenly they turned stone into something that was ruling and twisting, and it pulsed, and you could see blood pulsing in the veins beneath the skin of these objects. You could see him twisting and turning, and this man wriggling to free himself from this snake which has captured his sons, as it kind of grips on, and he feels himself losing the battle, and the pain in his face. And this was an amazing revolution. It's called the Greek Baroque. We don't know why they started doing it. We don't even know the real names of the artists that did it, but it was an unbelievable revolution in the way the human form. No one in any human society, any Homo sapiens, had ever thought of doing this. I think it's really underexplored kind of piece of territory. Look at the sculpture on the right. It's the Dying Gaul. It's in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And it's a different kind of sculpture, but he's been wounded through the chest, and as he looks down, he sees his life dripping away from him. His lifeblood itself is pouring out of him. This great warrior defeated. And the tragedy, the pathos in that, it's stone, but it's telling this story about a great hero brought to its knees. No one had done that in stone before. And I reckon this is one of the greatest revolutions in art. I think it's such a huge revolution in art that painting doesn't catch on for 1,200 years. Painting continues to do this exactly rigid, static thing for 1,000 years without really taking any notice of what sculpture's doing. This is the kind of paintings you see all the way across Western Europe, absolutely like a kabuki mask. You know, look at this is the Virgin Mary at the foot of the cross. You don't feel her sadness. To be honest, it looks like something from a play or something. There's no great tragedy there. You don't feel the weeping or the sorrow of a woman. Painting just continues knocking out this same old rigid thing for another 1,000, 1,500 years after sculpture starts doing it, until you get to the Italian Renaissance. And then suddenly painting clocks on, suddenly painting shifts, and you get this, right? And 1,000 pictures like this, where look at this cloth. No, there isn't a cloth on earth is that limpid, and even silk doesn't fold like that. This is a cloth, this is a painter showing off, I can do this with paint, and it does this. That's what this painter does. This is Mantegna saying, look how brilliant I am as a painter. And you know, look at that old lady in the corner. That's not the Virgin Mary, the previous picture. I'll tell you what that lady is. That's an old woman who's lost her kid, and she's bawling her eyes out. It's a completely different emotional response. And if you draw an X through this picture, the thing that's in the center of this picture is manhood, or his manness, his essence as a man, not a god, not a kind of flat two-dimensional kind of shield of a face, but as a real man who's dead now, and his mum's grieving him. And this was this revolution, but for some reason in painting, it took 1,500 years for painters to catch on, after the sculptors had already been doing it. And this idea of this kind of liquid, and the thing that really amazed me about the glacier more than anything was it's ice. Ice is water. Ice is water, and a glacier is ice times time, times pressure, times density. You can take water, which is the softest thing, right? You wash a baby's head in water, right? You would bathe a baby in water. But on a glacier, over thousands of years, with hundreds of foot of ice, with these pressures, you can use a glacier to carve through a mountain like it is made out of butter, like a knife going through warm butter. Like a hot knife going through butter, that's the phrase. Yeah, rock itself becomes plastic and carvable if water has time and temperature and pressure, and then it's like a diamond saw, the way it can cut through a glacier. And that's what really struck me about it, this kind of shift of states. And that's what you get on the glacier more than anything. So I wanted to kind of show that with the way I photographed the glacier. So I bought one of these, which every photographer should have. It's a balloon. It's kind of a balloon. It's like a kite, really, but it's got lift. And what I photographed it, if you can see in my hand there, I'm holding the light, the flash gun. So the light goes on the balloon, the camera stays on the ground, photographing the glacier. I was looking for a light to photograph the glacier that looks like the light that you get over an autopsy table. When I first saw the glacier wrapped in this decaying blanket, it looked to me like the glacier was being prepared for its own death. It looked like it was being wrapped in a shroud. And so the light, therefore, in my mind, has to be the light that you would see on a mortician's table. The light has to be in sympathy with the idea that you're trying to pursue as a photographer, I think. You could photograph it in the morning, evening, golden light, you could photograph it, I know, but it wouldn't be in sympathy with it. I wanted it to look like the glacier was being prepared for its own funeral, because it is, by our use of hydrocarbons. So the light, that light on a mortician's table is from above, and getting a light above a glacier is pretty difficult unless you've got a helicopter. It's quite hard to put a top light on a glacier. So I bought this balloon. It wasn't very expensive. It's a helium balloon, so it's not dangerous. It's not hydrogen. It can carry about 1 kilo. Which is about the weight of my flash gun. And it appears in all these pictures, it's just out of the frame, it's just above, and it's putting down this little cone of light onto the glacier, just a little cone of light. I would say it's like having your own personal moonlight that you can move to exactly where you want. That's what this kind of balloon did. So I'll just show you a little slideshow. There should be a little bit of music. It's only about 3 minutes long. And I'll just show you how I photographed it and the effect that I was looking for. Some very nice music. Good. I wanted you to see that because I wanted you to see how I think about a problem and how I go about where I bring in the imagination and where I find the inspirations for solving the problems, the lighting techniques that I kind of go to, and how to apply those to a kind of real world situation. And climate change is the main thing that I'm interested in nowadays, photographing climate change. So quickly on. So for ISHKAR, I wanted to show you the work that I made in Socotra. We went there last November. That we were only a group of 6 in the end. I think a couple of people had COVID, so couldn't come. I just want to show you the work I did as a way of trying to persuade you to come to Socotra in November. Exhibit number 1. Okay, that's my job done. Let's get in a taxi and go to the airport. Who's with me? It's that wonderful. It's just that great. This is where we go on the first day. I've been there 3 times now. I was sent for a travel magazine, a German travel magazine. I think it was the first time I went there. It's just, I mean, I've been to a lot of places. I've even been to Legoland, right? I've been to a lot of places, but I've got to say this is one of the most amazing places on earth. I mean, truly extraordinary kind of landscape. I know Tarim knows much more about this place, about how it works and where it's come from and why it looks the way it does. But it's just the most extraordinary. It's quite big. It's maybe 120 miles long or so, about 40 miles wide. So once you get into the thick of it, you really are out there on your own. It's only one plane a week. Only one plane a week. So you know how many tourists are on the island. They're on the plane, sat behind you. That's it, pretty much. And I guess the kind of star attraction, as well as these amazing beaches and white dunes, is these dragon's blood trees. And this time, with the help of Tarim and the group, really got into the sort of depth of the forest. Just an amazing privilege to spend a night in this landscape, to wake up in this landscape, to snooze in a hammock in this landscape. Something truly extraordinary. It's a place which kind of broke off from Africa about 100 million years ago or so. So it's kind of, all the species are kind of endemic. You don't really get them anywhere else. You get subspecies that don't occur anywhere else. I think people who study tiny little insects and stuff go nuts about Socotra because there's stuff there that isn't anywhere else on Earth. It's kind of like the Galapagos line in that sense. But also as a photographer, it's got a kind of, you know, simplicity, a kind of weird sort of rawness to it. These are frankincense trees. In the Middle Ages, the economy of Socotra was very much based upon the export of frankincense to the medieval churches of Europe. Every church in Europe was burning frankincense, had to come from somewhere. Well, it comes from the dried sap of these frankincense trees, the ones at the back, the wiggly ones at the back. The ones in the foreground are these nutty trees called bottle trees, which Tarim's going to explain later on, which are just the most bizarre, strange. They look like triffids. They look like something manufactured. They look like something from The Little Prince. I think something that should be inside a glass bell jar on the planet of The Little Prince. Most extraordinary things. The trips that we do, we go, it's all very rough. It's all camping. The camping is lovely, I've got to say. The people look after you really nicely, but the camping, there are no other hotels apart from the main town, and so you have to go up and get into it, and we fall asleep in these landscapes, and we wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go out and photograph them as the sun rises, and it's the most amazing kind of privilege. And on this trip, for the first time, I went to this huge dune field of white dunes on the south coast. Quite an extraordinary landscape. I mean, I've been in sand dunes before. I've been to places like Namibia and the Skeleton Coast, but white sand is an amazing thing because it's not just an object, it's also a reflector. And so it reflects all of the colors that are in the landscape around it, either the blue that's over your left shoulder or the gold of the setting sun that's in front of you to your right. And all of those are played back to you. It's a reflectant surface as much as a pile of sand. And so as a photographer, it's almost like a playground. The dragon trees are a most extraordinary thing. The sand is something where each face of it, as it faces towards the blue of the sky or the pink of the light or the kind of greeny yellow of the sunrise or the moon, we were up there in the full moon, just truly extraordinary. It's like a playtime for a photographer, really. Up in the mountains, there are these amazing kind of pools, which hopefully they'll be good for swimming in when we're there, if there's enough rain this winter. So it's pretty parched getting up there, but the reward of being allowed to kind of jump into one of these natural kind of infinity pools and is just quite extraordinary, beautiful chance, absolutely great opportunity. We camped here as well. This is in the, I forgot the name, Dehamri? No, I forgot the name of the place. Tarim will correct me later on. This is the forest of, what's it called? Haribo.
The Hom Hill Plateau.
Hom Hill Plateau, I'm very sorry. Hom Hill Plateau, fantastic place. This way to the frankincense trees, that way to the bottle trees, and that way to the infinity pool. Amazing, just great. This is one of the trips I did one of the first trips I went to the Hock Cave, fantastic cavern. got to say, it's one hell of a climb to get up there. It's a bit of a sweat to get up. So not all of the groups go there. I'm not sure whether we'll go. It's a full day's work, but the cave is extraordinary once we're inside. There's such a small island. It's got such a kind of density of landscapes. I think that's one of the things that's really amazing about it. You don't really have to go very far to be in something utterly different from where you woke up. This is that first picture, that beautiful lagoon. The people are fishing, and that actually was how my dinner was served that day. And the bottle trees. I'm going to show you some better bottle tree pictures later on, but that was a nice one. That was used as a cover for the magazine that I went from. So it's a trip aimed at photographers, people are interested in photography, but sort of travelers who photograph rather than kind of hardcore photo nuts. I'm happy to spend time with hardcore photo nuts, but certainly the last time we were there, I think we had 2 people on the trip who'd only really bought cameras in the last 6 months. So you couldn't call them like hardcore by any means. This is one of my pictures from the first time. I shot these on film the first time I went there. It's a bit scary now to think about shooting it on 5.4 film, but that's why the exposures are so long. And then a chance to swim in these places as well. Marine reserve, amazing snorkeling over the fish and the marines on this kind of coral reef that's just 20 meters off the beach, really. And this is in the white sand dunes. This last time we were there, under a full moon. Just glorious. Such a kind of joy to make such pictures, you know, just easy. Just go out and bring them home. You know, you don't have to you just have to kind of gather them up and bring them back in. As a photographer, that's a fantastic experience. And I just tacked on the end. Here's one of Tarim's pictures. Some of the pictures of the people that were on the last trip, just to show you real pictures that were shot by real people that came last time I was there. There was only 6 of us, but this is one of Tarim's. Nice picture, Tarim. Good picture. Nice stuff. And another one. This is one of Eva, one of the photographers that came with us. American woman, very nice, really good company as well. And this is a husband, Scott. Really lovely work. They were quite experienced travelers. They've been everywhere. These 2. They've been to Antarctica, polar bears, and everything. Bill, less so, haven't been to many places, but really beautiful. When he sent me a big clutch of JPEGs, I was like, wow, gorgeous picture. I wish I'd done it. And Mark was someone who was shooting on film, but had only really started taking pictures in the last 6 months or so. To be honest, he only started taking pictures because his friend had a lab, so he got his films processed free. But lovely work. And there's another one of Tarim's. This landscape, when we go up to the plateau where the dragon trees, I remember repeatedly looking at it and thinking, if a dinosaur came round the corner in the middle of this picture and walked through the frame, it's me that's out of place. It would look so in its place, and I'm the one that shouldn't really be here. It's so where it ought to be. It's just the most extraordinary landscape in that respect. It seemed kind of prehistoric, but yeah. And these are Kalev, one of the travelers that came last time. He was obsessed with these little trees, bottle trees, which are this bizarre, preposterous fat little lumps of a thing. And I took a load of lighting with me, and I lit them for him because we wanted to shoot them at night and kind of turn them into kind of portraits of them. And where they grow is quite a confusing background. So by lighting them, kind of like how I lit them on the glacier, really, but I'm just using a flash gun on a pole. But we wanted to sort of make a series of portraits of just kind of how the sort of gorgeous little fat, rotund, little plump shapes of these objects. And then bizarre, sometimes they just have 4 leaves or a single flower, just the most ridiculous plants I've ever seen in my life. Full of character, a bit mad, didn't seem to really work very well as a plant. So the sort of functional part is just like 6 leaves, and then the rest of it is this huge bottle which is storing water through the dry seasons. And they also seem to grow out of nothing at all. I don't know where the nutrients come from. But I thought Kalev made some really nice pictures of them, lovely kind of portraits of them. And Swanali, who came on the trip, another beginner photographer, only owned a camera for about 6 months, and yet of all of us who tried repeatedly to get a really good astro picture of the Milky Way, she pulled off by far the best picture of the Milky Way of the whole bunch of us. It's a really nice picture. that's kind of what we did. That's where we went, and that's what we did. It was, you know, I've been to a lot of places, truly special. It's really hard to get to. You need someone like Tarim with you. You need someone like Tarim's, the people that he works with on the ground in Socotra. You need someone like ISHKAR behind you, because it is quite awkward to get to. No great threats or anything. It's not scary. I've been to a lot worse. But it just requires some kind of organizing. And then because it's camping, you need someone like Tarim and his people who are going to make sure that there's food and there's showers and the tents move and it's comfortable and it's not rough. And, you know, I'm not eating hedgehog. I'm too old for that. I want a bit of comfort, but it is camping and it's really nice. It's really good fun. And the camping allows you to really be in the thick of it. We can ask for just general questions from people first of all, but could I mean, Tarim's here. He's the kind of expert. I mean, can I ask Tarim a couple of questions about is that okay, Claire? Ask about the flora in particular, which has always kind of baffled me. I mean, bottle trees. Tarim, how does a bloody bottle tree work? Because it didn't seem to kind of be a real plant to me. It's just an idea for a plant that was never really
It sure
finished.
doesn't look like one. Yeah, I love the comparison between the triffids. I remember that Khaled was often speaking about this book, The Attack of the Triffids. I actually had never heard of it before I met him. But when I looked it up afterwards, and it just made perfect sense. I mean, seeing the bottle trees and how strange and alien-like they look, it made sense to think that they might just be from another planet. But yeah, I mean, as strange as they might look, as alien as they might look, they are still plants, and they are very adaptable, very special plants that have withstood the course of time and haven't really changed for millions of years, like most other flora on Socotra, actually. And that's what makes it such a special archipelago, is that whereas the remaining region around Socotra has essentially desertified and become all-out desert, Socotra has maintained this incredible ecosystem and community of flora that resembles what potentially flora looked like throughout that latitudinal band millions of years ago. And I remember we were speaking about this, actually, the only other place in which you find dragon blood trees to the scale at which you'd find in Socotra is in the Canary Islands. And I remember you sent me a photo actually after our trip in which there was one that reaches something like 22 meters tall. And I was thinking to myself, that's incredible. So yeah, the flora is definitely one of the factors that makes Socotra so special. One of the many, let's put it that way. And seeing how humans have, managed to live alongside and use this flora and use it to various benefits and various different things is what makes Socotra really a gem on the world scale. And actually, we're asking about the bottle tree. So yeah, the bottle tree keeps itself alive, maintain the majority of its nutrients, and it does absorb nutrients from the soil, from the very little soil it has access to. Maintains the majority of its water within that bulbous body. It kind of flows between having leaves, having flowers, depending on how dry the season is, depending on how much sun there is, depending on various other factors. But extremely hardy plants, and they can live for a long time. They grow very slowly, much like the dragon blood trees. They're plants that grow very slowly. And I don't know if you remember, but you can come across some in Socotra that get to be close to about 3 meters tall. The majority of them are very small, like those photos we saw, but there's some pretty big bottle trees as well. And it's actually endemic subspecies. The species Adenium obesum, the bottle trees, found all throughout the Arabian Peninsula, southern Arabian Peninsula, Horn of Africa, East Africa. So they are fairly widespread, but the subspecies present on Socotra is only found there and is very likely the highest density of bottle trees in general, the entire species, along with so many other species of flora and fauna. Actually, I can think of the Egyptian vultures, another very popular photo subject, probably because they're the only bird on the planet that will let you take photos of them so up close, but also a great subject for photography. That's also the highest density of Egyptian vultures on the planet, found in Socotra. And dragon blood tree, I mean, the only place you find dragon blood trees on Earth, but definitely the highest density as well. And also, I mean, a high density of different succulent species. Much like the bottle tree, there's quite a few different succulents that only grow in Socotra and that grow especially well on Socotra, some of which are very hard to find. So when you do come across one, it's kind of like like you were saying earlier, you know, sorting through all the rubble to find this little hidden gem that you blow off and say, wow, beautiful. And if you have a macro lens with you, make for some fantastic photography as well. So yeah, there's so much to explore when it comes to flora, when it comes to fauna, when it comes to geography, when it comes to geology. I mean, you name it, and there's something to talk about that in many cases hasn't been documented yet in Socotra, which adds an element of intrigue and excitement to the process of documenting it, photographically, speaking about it, observing it simply. And so, yeah, can't wait to go back. All this talk about Socotra is getting me excited to go back. Really. And to see you again there, Simon. We missed you in March, but you were greatly, you were greatly missed.
Yeah, I'm sorry we couldn't go in March. But it feels to me like it's so dense. You know, you only go an hour and it's like a completely different place to where you woke up. And you also genuinely feel like you're the only one that sees this thing. I mean, we barely saw anybody else, any other tourists. I mean, we were in villages and things, and we were seeing people go and have cups of tea with, and the rest of it, you know, local people. But I mean, we barely saw any other tourists the whole time. So you really feel like you're on your own, like you're not, of course, but you feel like you're really the first one discovering these things. And then the thing that you're discovering is just like, oh my God, I never saw a thing like that before. I never saw those kind of mountains. I never saw these dunes so white. I never saw this bizarre spiky tree. And then you scratch the side of it and the sap is bright red. It's just the most extraordinary thing.
No, it's also kind of I think many people find it to be a museum for the senses also, because you have all these aromatic trees, you have all these visually astounding landscapes and people using the landscapes and the plants and animals. You have, you know, tastes, all different types of fish. You can eat a raw oyster off the side of a rock and it tastes like the sea. Really, it tastes like the fullest representation of the sea. So it really is a museum for the senses in all sense of the term. And yeah, I mean, once again, there's all these different things, the density, and then once again, another just cherry on top of the cake is how humans have adapted to utilize, to let themselves be inspired by this landscape. I mean, you think of the poetry, you think of archaeological remains, you think of all these different things, and how the landscape, the flora, the fauna, the climate even has contributed to the development of this extremely rich cultural heritage for the amount of people that live there and the area covered. And then with the added interesting, maybe worrisome element of how that cultural heritage is facing the onslaught of globalization, of plastic waste. I mean, all those different things there is to talk about. So it really is, it's an encyclopedia. For being such a small island, relatively small, excuse me, it is quite big. And with a small population, once again, relatively, it really is an encyclopedia that takes a lifetime to cover.
And Tarim, you mentioned just a little bit earlier around the cultural significance of different plants and things on Socotra Island. And Simon, earlier when you were talking about the effects of, you know, climate change on the planet and then our need to take action and to prevent this overuse of our natural resources because they are finite. Something that I've always found quite fascinating about Socotra has been that these checks and balances culturally have been in place for such a long time, right, Tarim? Like, you know, Socotra, for the lack of awareness that we may have about it at the moment, there was a time where it was very important in terms of the spice trade. And Simon, you touched on that earlier, you know, where it was really a critical source of frankincense and other things in terms of, you know, what was going on globally at the time and what was considered a precious commodity. And I know, Tarim, when we've been out there before, you've discussed the fact that for people just to get a ceiling beam in their house, there needs to be a process of basically applying for permission to cut down a tree. You need to speak with the local sheikh, and you know, there's all these things culturally that are so tied to this very careful management of natural resources, which arguably is why these things are still in such abundance on Socotra, why the fishing and the fish, when you go snorkeling, it's like this incredible kaleidoscope of color, and why these things are still being maintained. And I think bringing that interest that Simon has in terms of preservation of the natural world and knowing that there's still a place like Socotra, where that interest is still being maintained in preserving its natural heritage, in spite of the fact that the Portuguese tried to colonize, the Soviets have stuck their tanks along the shoreline, I think is quite an incredible thing to explore over the course of the time that will be on Socotra too.
Yeah, and the Brits, by the way.
Yeah.
That's the point.
I actually watched
Very well said.
Yeah, there was an interesting video that came out in terms of Vimto and how Vimto ended up in Yemen. And I mean, you know, we've seen as a result of the British, you know, in the past. But I think also this might be an interesting time to invite people who have any questions to ask, either in terms of Simon's work or travel to Socotra. If anyone would like to ask any questions, then I'll be happy to share those with Simon or Tarim, if anyone would like to do that. Or maybe while we're waiting for...
Just Claire, while we're waiting for people to ask, what are the dates for November?
The 7th to the 14th of November are the dates. And what I will also do just while we're here is I'll share the link to the website in the chat, just so that everybody has it if they're interested in information on the trip specifically. And then for anyone who would like to join us in November, on that link, you can book a call and then we can chat through any of the details in terms of the logistics and the flights and practicalities for travel in and out of Socotra too. So yes, I don't know if anyone is keen to ask any questions. Otherwise, I know that Tarim and Simon could talk longer in terms of the diversity of the island.
Well, I think one thing that I didn't really talk about, but I mean, Tarim knows more about it because he's got his finger on the pulse on the ground, is that it's not a dangerous place. Yemen is at war. The war is kind of a little bit frozen at the moment, but it has been at war for a long time now. But the island is far away from that. It's a 2-hour flight. In the old days when you could fly from Yemen to the island, it was still 2 hours on the plane. So it's a long way away. And it feels very, very far away from the war. There are there are some traces. You can see some old Soviet tanks that are built into the hillside here and there. Everyone goes off to photograph them. And there is a political, there are undoubtedly political problems there with the way the war has unfolded, but it feels like it's really far away from the conflict, and it's been kind of isolated, not out of any kind of kindness. To be honest, it's been rather abandoned and left to its own devices in the last year, is my feeling. I don't know, what do you feel, Tarim? It feels like it's just been sort of hived off and let to go, really, almost.
Yeah, I mean, since humans have inhabited Socotra, it's maintained this very important strategic position on the global scale and also within the regional dynamic as well right now. So since the war started in Yemen, I mean, even during the uprisings and then the subsequent war, Socotra was always kind of exactly abandoned. There's no natural resources there. The only real source of revenue on the island right now is tourism. And of course, during the war, tourism isn't the first thing that blossoms. So since roughly 2013-14, tourism was completely cut off the island and only really came back in around 2018. And during that stint, the Yemeni government, rightfully so, had other things to think about. So they weren't investing much into Socotra. During that time, Socotris being extremely self-reliable people, largely due to the harshness of the island, the harsh geography of the island, the separation, the geographic and climatic separation from any other mainland during the monsoon season, for example, has taught Socotris to be extremely ingenuitive, have extreme ingenuity, and learn how to take care of themselves. And that's exactly what they started doing during that period of lack of governance, essentially. Something that I think we were talking about when we were on the island, Simon, are the Socotra license plates, and that they started printing their own license plates. They said, bye-bye Yemeni government license plates. We're going to start issuing our own registration for vehicles on the island. So that was an interesting example of the sort. They started bottling their own drinking water. They started doing quite a few things. It's become a lot more complicated in the last 4 or 5 years because of foreign interest in the island, mostly coming from wealthier Gulf states, and it's unclear what the future will hold for Socotra. And there's also very much of a mixed bag of opinions from Socotris themselves regarding where they see the future of the island and what they want for the island politically. But when we're speaking about safety, I mean, I've asked over a dozen old men on Socotra, and I'm sure both Claire and Simon are aware. Anyone that's been to Socotra are aware an old man on Socotra is in his youth in the West. I don't know, something around 70 years old. I'm curious to see what the average life expectancy is there. I haven't seen any statistics on that, but I've asked over a dozen old men if they've ever heard of a homicide in Socotra, and they said our grandfathers have never heard of a homicide in Socotra. So it seems as if there hasn't been a documented homicide on Socotra in the last 100 years at least. Who knows? Of course, documentation is always an issue in certain places, but it's incredibly safe. And this is something that Socotris hold very, very, very dear. They are by far the least inflammatory population I've heard of. It's hard to get in an argument with a Socotri, seemingly, not that anyone's looking for it, but yeah, the safety of the island is something they hold extremely dear. And you hear that said time and time again. Oh, this is the safest place on earth. You can sleep anywhere you want. You can sleep on the side of the road. You can sleep on the beach. There's no animals to hurt you. There's no people to hurt you. There's no plants to hurt you. You're completely fine here. And that applies to the animals as well. There is no dangerous snakes on the island. I mean, the only time there's been documented shark attacks have been kilometers offshore. There's really not that many dangerous fish. There's a few, but every ocean has dangerous fish. It's really, really safe. I mean, all things considered, it's a very safe part of the world, which exactly is contrary to what you hear on the conventional media of Yemen.
So I've got a few questions
culturally.
Here, sorry to cut you off, Tarim. I've got a few questions that I'm through, and a few of those are logistical, and some of them are in relation to the culture of Socotra, and Simon, also some stuff around your creative process. So I'll answer the logistical stuff first, just to get it out of the way, and then hand over to you guys for the other questions. One of the questions was just in terms of the flights and whether those are coming from Cairo. There is a flight with Yemeni Airlines that goes via Sayoun to Socotra. However, that flight can be a little bit logistically complicated, and for that reason we make use of the flight from Abu Dhabi, which goes once a week, every Monday direct. The flight from Cairo tends to go via Sayoun, and it can be a little bit more complicated getting the visas lined up in order to get that information to the airline, and so it's a bit more complex, and that's the reason that we coordinate with the flight now from Abu Dhabi. I had somebody else ask about, once someone has traveled to Socotra, are there countries you can no longer visit, such as the US with ESTA? So once you visited Yemen, among a few other countries, you are no longer eligible to apply for ESTA. Having said that, though, I had a similar situation when I'd been to Iran. After that, I applied for a B1, B2 visa to enter the US. So that just required me physically going to the embassy for an interview, and then my B1, B2 visa was valid for longer than my ESTA had been. Having said that, when you enter Socotra, you can also ask that your passport not be stamped. We had a traveler who came with us in March who already had his ESTA, who asked just not to have his passport stamped, and has since re-entered the US on his existing ESTA visa. You would just need to be careful with the fact that if you apply for ESTA, you will be asked, have you been in these countries, of which Yemen would be one on the list? So you would have to say yes, or potentially be prosecuted for lying if you were later found out. But there are ways around that for re-entry to the US without needing ESTA once you've been to Yemen. Then from there, Simon, I have a question for you just regarding the photographic equipment you use, whether that's film, whether that's digital, and just what your equipment is. And then once you've answered that, Tarim, I've been asked just in terms of cultural differences between Socotra and mainland Yemen. So Simon, if I can maybe start with you.
Well, a couple of people brought film with them to the island. It was they didn't have any problems with X-rays. The film all got home safe. But I mean, I can't think of a great reason to be shooting film in this day and age. I think it's a bit mad and it's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit Neanderthal. At the same time, I don't think it's the kind of place where you need to bring a crazy amount of camera gear. I carry, a couple of little bodies, little Sony cameras. I think I took my Phase 1 camera with me, which is a bit of a beast, but I only took it because Karlev wanted to shoot it on for what he was doing. So you don't need to have reams and reams of camera gear. You don't need to have some fancy, great big thing that's the size of a small car with a motor drive on it and the rest of it. You're not going to be photographing Formula One racing cars racing past at 600 miles an hour. You're not going to be photographing, a distant birds that are 5 kilometers away. So just take a couple of small little cameras, and the best camera to take is the one that you have with you, the one that you have in your hand when something nice happens. I think the only piece of kit that people took, which they hadn't been used to using in the past, which I thought was great and people really enjoyed using, although it's a pain in the bum, is a tripod. Because with a tripod, then you can start to think about photographing the Milky Way, photographing under moonlight. We'll try and work around the full moon and trying to make opportunities, maybe even go out hiking at night under a full moon, which is really glorious if it's possible. There's always a possibility of bioluminescent seas on Socotra, which I've never seen in my life. And for that, you need a tripod. So a small tripod is a nice piece of kit to bring because it just sort of extends the shooting day. You can start to shoot into the gloom without racking up the ISO to something crazy. So that's the only thing I'd say. But apart from that, don't go mad with the camera gear. I don't want people swamped in crazy lenses that, you just need a little standard lens, a little long lens, a little tripod, and maybe a spare camera in case something breaks. That's it. And that's usually all I carry on a job. And film, forget it. Tarim?
Yeah, so I think, Tarim, if you're there, then the next question was just regarding how the culture on Socotra might differ to mainland Yemen, unless we've lost.
So the most evident example of how it differs is the language. So Socotra is actually home to an endemic language spoken nowhere else, which is part of a family of languages that once occupied the entire South Arabian Peninsula, but which is, except for Socotri, all but extinct now. There's a few people that speak the remaining 4 languages of the family in South Arabia, but Socotri is definitely the most spoken out of the modern South Arabian languages of the family. So that's one of the most evident examples of how the culture differs. But otherwise, I think it can in part be traced back to geography as well. I think geography is an enormous component that contributes to the development of a culture. And whereas mainland Yemen differs between these really, really tall, jagged, harsh mountains to true desert in the Rub al Khali and the Anti Corridor, to much more, arid lowland landscapes in the eastern part of Yemen. Socotra has a very different landscape, very different composition of different landscapes. And I think this has also enormously impacted the culture there and the development of the culture there. One of the main ways in which this has happened has been in tandem with the domestication of goats. I'm sure anyone that's been to Socotra has read anything about Socotra has come across the topic of goats. Goats are extremely important on Socotra and have been that way for thousands of years. Socotra is a particularly harsh part of the world when it comes to climate. Right about now, between mid-May and mid-September, it's basically closed off from the rest of the world because of a harsh monsoon season. Really strong, dry, hot air that sweeps across the landscape. Very little rain during this season, so it's hard to grow any crops, hard to essentially gather your own food if it's not wild or if it's not domesticated livestock. The livestock of choice are goats. Goats are everywhere there. In many cases, they're treated better than humans. Claire and I have some funny stories about that, which I'm sure we'll come across again if anyone wants to visit Socotra. So the livestock culture is also a feature that's very different from the mainland. The mainland has a lot more arable land, which leads to a different food culture, different culinary culture as well. It's Socotra has also developed a very different way of interpreting Islam. Both Yemen and Socotra are vast majority Muslim. Yemen has a very small population of Baha'i, mainland Yemen, very small population of Hindu, very small population of Christian. And the same goes for Socotra, except for the Baha'i. But historically, Socotra was actually a stronghold for Sufi scholarship, for Sufi Islam. And actually the oldest mosque on Socotra is a Sufi mosque and is still used as such, not always, but in small particular congregations used as a Sufi mosque. In fact, one of the most famous schools for Sufi Islam is in Hadramaut, the governor directly north of Socotra in mainland Yemen, actually in the city of Tarim, ironically. But in April, actually it wasn't with you, Claire, but in April we came across a group of Sufi scholars from Tarim that were visiting Socotra on a little vacation, actually. Before Ramadan, they were visiting Socotra on a little vacation and to explore further into the Sufi history of Socotra. So there's a bunch of different factors that make Socotra both radically different from the mainland in terms of culture, but also some similarities that permeate, Yemen, all of Yemen. Because at the end of the day, Socotra might not be Yemen culturally, might not be Yemen geographically, but politically has been Yemen for, what is it now, 30 plus years. And so some features of that, political identification have shined through. And, I'm sure both of you remember, Claire and Simon, you meet a lot of mainland Yemenis on Socotra as well. So they're always bringing their interpretation of the island, their culture, their way of seeing things from the mainland. So it's kind of a beautiful mosaic of people from all across Yemen and the world. And yeah.
Okay, I've got another two questions for you. One was from someone who's been on Socotra back in 2006, and they're wondering how much it's developed or changed since. My first visit was only 2019. Simon, I know you've been there quite a bit, but perhaps Tarim, that's one for you to answer. And then also just how the conservation efforts are going on the island.
So 2006, actually before, yeah, sorry.
Well, the only thing I would say different between 2000 is not much different at all outside the city, but the main city transformed a great deal. Money is being spent by the UAE and the Saudis, hospitals, port facilities. It seems a lot more developed, and there's a lot more trash as well. There's the arrival of plastic. I don't remember seeing any plastic when I went there in 2005 or whenever the first time I went. Whereas now that it's bad with plastic. Outside of the city, I couldn't really put my finger on any change at all in the last 15 years. But Tarim, what do you think?
So I would say exactly that. The city has almost doubled in size. Has not exactly, but coming up on doubled in population size as well. There's many more modern facilities now, as you said, a hospital, there's many more vehicles in the city, there's many more foreign products being imported. The first time I went in 2008, I remember that if you were lucky, you found potatoes, onions, maybe some chili peppers. Now you find apples from France, you find a whole bunch of different, fruits and vegetables from the mainland, from across the world. So many different imports have started arriving in Socotra as well. There's, I think, something to be said about the fact that it's changed a lot in terms of how the inhabitants, and you see this most in the city once again, the outlook of inhabitants pre and post-war. And it's not what one would expect. Whereas in mainland Yemen, you see a lot, and I haven't been back since 2014 in mainland Yemen, but I hear from a lot of friends of mine that there is somewhat of a lack of optimism in mainland Yemen. I don't see that at all in Socotra. I don't know if you can say the same, both of you that have been there recently, but Socotra's still maintain this kind of incredible optimism that shines through, despite the fact that they don't have a government, they don't have any sort of form of welfare or social services of any sort. They just seem to maintain this optimism, which is something that really stands out to me every time I go back. But in terms of physical changes outside of the city, I can't think of any, except for any changes in terms of development. A few changes that are continuously happening are there are less trees, there are less dragonblood trees. Unfortunately, the dragonblood trees are disappearing rather rapidly, and some estimates put that within the next 50, 60 years, there might not be any left. The age structure of the dragonblood community, the dragonblood tree community, is extremely old. There are no babies anywhere on the island, except for those being cultivated in human hands and under human care. And another interesting feature that has changed over the course of the last 20 or so years is that there are many less people living in caves, which was once something that was basically the only way to live on Socotra. I mean, built structures are very rudimentary, I'm sure outside of the city, are fairly rudimentary structures. It's usually just drywall with ceiling beams. And so once again, this is rudimentary relative to, you know, those beautiful archaeological remains you were showing us from Afghanistan or, you know, Central Asia. But a lot of people, and that's because the majority, with the geology of the island, has brought to the presence of an enormous amount of caves throughout the island, ranging from multiple kilometers deep to, you know, a few meters deep. And these caves were once home to an enormous amount of humans that would either set up permanent residence in certain caves or change between different caves on transhuman cycles. So whether bringing their livestock up and down the mountain for the rainy or dry season, would occupy these caves as either permanent or transient accommodation, essentially. You don't get much of that anymore. There's probably 2 or 3 people left on the island that partially inhabit caves, but don't permanently inhabit caves anymore. So that's something I remember even in 2009, I remember there was up in the Firmhin forest, when the sun went down, you would see quite a few caves around with fires and smoke coming out of them. You don't see that anymore, unfortunately. And that's a testament to how quickly things are changing on Socotra. Both speaking of the trees, how quickly these trees are, you know, disappearing, which is also kind of makes it even more important that people see them while they're still there, and that with this visualization of this immense natural heritage, immense cultural heritage, can maybe come a sort of inspiration that then leads to the tendency to conserve and, you know, at least contribute to the conservation of these resources. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said, and I would love to talk with you more about this, Simon, about how visualization can translate into conservation. Because I know my conservation inspiration all came from watching BBC documentaries. I remember when I was a child and didn't even understand what a mammal was, but I would watch BBC documentaries and say, wow. And then that led to, you know, some more hands-on interaction with animals, and then that led to my decision to dedicate the rest of my life to their conservation. So I'm sure you have a lot to say about how visualization translates into conservation, and we can leave that for a chat on Socotra, fireside chat.
I would just say the only thing is that my job is to make you fall in love with it. You will not cherish what you do not love, and my job is to make you love it. I think that's what you do too. When you start talking about it, it's like a romance. I think that's why it's great when you talk.
Based on your photos, I imagine that you can't make someone fall in love with something unless you love it yourself as well. So maybe you can translate.
Well, thanks, anyway. Tarim and Simon. We've run a little bit over with the questions, so I don't want to steal more of your time. But what I will say is that I think it's very easy to talk well into the night around a campfire, around all the elements that make up Socotra. And the best way to do that is to have our imaginations sparked during the day so we can discuss all the things we've seen while we unwind in the evenings on the island. So if anyone is interested in travel to Socotra, I have shared the links so that we can discuss further for anyone who's keen to come along and meet Tarim and Simon in person and to play around with the landscapes through the camera lens, as well as to literally like feel, taste, touch, like everything on the island. There's plenty of that, from pulling off the bark from the frankincense trees and putting it on the campfire at night and smelling the smells, or swimming in the ocean if and when we come across the bioluminescence and all of those sorts of things. So thank you, Tarim and Simon, for your time this evening. And Simon, again, an amazing conversation around your career so far and your love of photography. And yeah, thank you for sharing that with us this evening, as well as you, Tarim.
Great. Thank you, Tarim. Thanks,
Great.
Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Claire. Thank you everyone for attending.
Great. See you in November, Tarim. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
All the best, Simon. Take care. If not sooner, hopefully.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for
Cheers.
tuning in.
Bye.